Good evening, and I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight for the first Mayor's Meetup, and I believe the first city event in person since the beginning of March. So welcome. As we adapt and modify how we're going to do things, at least for the next little while, I'm very grateful that you all took a chance and are going to spend some time with myself and our police chief, Billy Grogan. Before I go on, I want to recognize, y'all can just wave, members of City Council that are here. Wave your hands, say hello, thank you all for being here, as well as members of our Parks Department and Communications Department, and of course our fine Dunwoody police officers. And a special appreciation to the Dunwoody Police Foundation, which is here tonight and is a relatively new organization that started to help support our police department. The idea of the Mayor's Meetups is to do a deep dive on different city functions. And as most of you are probably aware, earlier this summer, I guess summer's now over, at the beginning of summer, when George Floyd was murdered, it brought yet another spotlight on policing. And with that, we got lots of questions. And Chief and I answered lots of emails, but we knew we wanted to do something in person, and rather than Zoom, which serves as a good communications device in these difficult times, but this is warmer and more accessible, and we will do them on other subjects. As the weather changes, they may very well be on Zoom. So it is important to know that you can both support the police and have questions and concerns. And so that's a big reason why I started with Chief Grogan as my first guest at our meetup with the mayor, because, like I said, lots of people have had questions. Chief Grogan has been with the city of Dunwoody since the inception of the police department. He has came to us from Marietta. He has led the department from its very beginning to where we are now. We are a relatively, in Georgia, mid-sized city that grows to a large city during non-COVID times because of the employment center at Perimeter Center. And so we are not an easy community to manage. You know, what we need at night is different than what we need at day. Weekends, we have a major mall, which has evolved into a regional mall. We have all kinds of things that make us different than many other cities in Georgia. And so Chief Grogan has helped us grow a police force that has served this community well. We have evolved with technology. We have evolved with the size of our police department, and we continue to evolve. Chief Grogan is widely respected as a leader in the field, and I'm sure he can tell you, but he was recently appointed to a presidential committee on training, right? On training. And I look forward to y'all hearing about his philosophies on hiring and training and maintaining our police force. And with that, I give you Chief Billy Grogan.
Thank you, Mayor Deutsch. I appreciate that introduction. Today, I appreciate the opportunity to stand before all of you and share some information about the Dunwoody Police Department and to answer any questions you may have. I have some prepared remarks, but I'm certainly open at the end to answering any questions. Test, 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 test. So I'm certainly open to answering all of your questions tonight to the best of my ability. As the mayor said, we find ourselves in kind of an unusual place today. I think there's probably no one here that would say 2020 has been a normal year. For law enforcement, it's been an especially challenging year. The death of George Floyd sparked protests across the country and even here in Dunwoody. I supported those peaceful protests as I publicly condemned the actions of the officers in Minneapolis. Still, I'm greatly disturbed by the calls to defund the police sweeping through our country, which will likely have an adverse impact on high crime areas where the police are needed the most. I'm also concerned about people generalizing the bad actions of police officers in one community and suggesting or believing that is how all police officers conduct themselves. Nothing could be further from the truth. Nothing could be further from the truth. I've received many emails over the last several months with questions about how our department operates. Some of the emails even offered suggested changes to our operations, and we looked at all of those. So for a few minutes tonight, I would like to share some information about our officers, how they're selected, our core values and what we believe, and how we operate. At the end, as I said, I'd be happy to answer any questions. So my hope is that by the end of the night, you will have a better understanding of the Dunwoody Police Department and feel confident that we are committed to providing fair and impartial policing services to those we serve. So first, I want to talk about the selection of police officers at our department. Police officers in general, this is at most departments, go through a very rigorous hiring process, frankly quite different from most professions. So first, officers have to go through a PT test to get hired. Once they pass that, which is, we have people fail that quite frequently, they're interviewed by an interview panel made up of officers within the department and supervisors who ask them questions to try to determine their suitability to be a police officer in Dunwoody. Once they go through that, then they subjected to a pretty intensive background check. I think the packet's about 28 or 30 pages they have to fill out. We do a pretty extensive background check, including talking to neighbors as well as talking to their references. Once they pass the background check, and which basically they have nothing in their background that would prevent them from being a police officer, then they get an interview with the chief. And so I can tell you, when I conduct my interview, I'm trying to get a sense of what that person's about. And really, I'm trying to find out, is that person a good fit for the Dunwoody Police Department? Will they fit in with our culture? Because we're community focused. We focus a lot with our officers on having good interpersonal skills, being good communicators, having a heart for service, and compassion for others. So if they don't fit in with that, then that's the process will stop there, and they won't get hired. And a number of times I've interviewed people and just felt like they were not a good fit for our department, and they weren't hired. Just so that you know, our core values are integrity, teamwork, courage, service, respect, and professionalism. So we've had many officers come to our department from much larger ones, such as Atlanta, DeKalb, Cobb, Gwinnett. But they come here in a lot of cases because they want to have that, work at a smaller department so they can have that really close relationship with their community. And so that was one of the driving factors for them to come to our department. So once they make it through an interview with me, then we go through a process where they have a voice stress analyzer test, which is a lie detector test basically. They do a drug screen, and then they finish up with a psychological screening to determine if that person would make a good police officer. And so once they get through all that process and we have an opening, then they're hired. So we go through a real rigorous process to hire the best officers we can. And we started that from day one when we had to start up the department and hire 40 officers to begin. And we've continued that tradition till today. So while we're talking about our staff, I wanted to give you a little bit of our demographics because people are always interested in that. So I'm going to go through a few of these and tell you what the 2010 census says and the makeup of our department. And then also I'll note that, we're in the middle of doing the 2020 census, and I'm sure our demographics will change pretty substantially in Dunwoody. So white is 2010 census is 69.8%, and that's made up of about 67.7% of our department. African American officers in the city is 12.8%, and our department is 12.9%. Asian American in our census was 11.1%, and we only have 3.2% Asian officers. Hispanic. So Hispanic in our population is 10.3%, and our department is 12.9%. And then people identify two or more races. Census was 2.3%, and our department is 3.2%. And then females, that's where we really lag behind. The 2010 census is 48.1%. And our department is at 8%. We're fortunate. Our last officer we hired was a female, so we're excited about that. Also, 58% of our officers have a college degree, and a number of them are continuing to work on their education right now, and we anticipate they'll get their degree later this year or next year. And then 19.3% of our officers have an advanced degree. So that's to let you know just a little bit about them. And now I want to tell you a little bit about our training. So the state of Georgia requires 20 hours of training each year. And as part of that annual training, officers must take 2 hours of use of force and de-escalation training, that's required by the state, and 2 hours of community policing training each year. So all of our officers do that each and every year. We conduct firearms training twice a year. And since our North Shallowford Annex building opened, we've been able to provide scenario-based training using our firearms simulator over there. If you've attended a Citizens Police Academy recently, you got to use that piece of equipment, which is really good. And additionally, we have been able to conduct defensive tactics training. So when situations require officers to use physical force, defensive tactics training teaches them and allows them to learn how to do this to best protect themselves and protect others. Since many of our high-risk encounters are with people experiencing a mental health crisis, the department signed the One Mind pledge with the IACP, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, several years ago. We are now fully compliant with the pledge, having put our entire staff through the 8-hour mental health first aid class, and over 50% of our staff through the 40-hour crisis intervention training class. In 2019, our police officers averaged 146 hours of training, well above the state mandated requirements. All of our officers have completed police legitimacy and procedural justice for community relations training. And then we recently sent 4 officers to complete the Train the Trainer class for fair and impartial policing, which includes implicit bias training. And our entire department is scheduled to be trained in that later this year, early next year. The mayor and city council have provided great equipment for our department to use, and we certainly thank them for that. Part of that includes in-car cameras, so all of our traffic stops are documented, and we've had those since the very beginning. We added to our equipment list body-worn cameras about 5 years ago. And both of those pieces of equipment prove very valuable in documenting the actions of officers and holding them accountable. We also have less lethal uses of force, such as pepper spray, a taser, and bean bags when needed. We do not carry a baton. I know a lot of people carry an ASP, which is a little small baton that extends, and we made a decision when we first started that we were not going to carry an ASP because of a couple of reasons. One, most officers don't use it very effectively. The second thing is, no matter what the situation is, it never looks good for an officer to be striking someone with an object like that. So let me move into use of force a little bit because people are always interested in that. So in our policy, it kind of outlines the different levels of use of force. And so the majority of our calls, the only thing it requires is an officer presence. So we're on the scene, and that's as far as it goes. Sometimes we have to use verbal commands, sometimes soft hand techniques, sometimes hard hand techniques. then pepper spray or the taser, and very infrequently, if ever, a firearm. We received, the mayor and I, she alluded to it, a lot of emails related to our use of force policy and kind of questioning what we had and offering suggestions. So I wanted to touch on our policy briefly. So our policy, and this has been in place for several years, bans chokeholds. It requires de-escalation. It places a value on human life. Officers also have a duty to intervene if excessive force is being used. Officers are restricted from firing at a moving vehicle except under limited circumstances where their life is in danger. Officers can only use the force necessary and proportional to the amount needed to gain control. This can escalate and de-escalate during the same incident. When possible, officers must exhaust all other means before using deadly force. Officers are required to give a warning before deploying pepper spray or deploying a taser. In most circumstances, a verbal warning will be given prior to using deadly force, but it is not required by policy. And that's because there could be instances where you might have to go to deadly force immediately and not have an opportunity to give a warning. And to put that in as a policy requirement would cause the officers to have to violate that policy. But in most cases, officers are using comments like drop the gun, drop the knife, show me your hands, things like that. So they are given warnings. When we have a use of force incident in Dunwoody, that is investigated through the chain of command of the person who uses it. So for instance, if it's an officer on a shift, the sergeant is the first line supervisor that reviews that use of force. And then it goes to the lieutenant, then to the major, the deputy chief, and we have a use of force experts in our department. They'll review it. Ultimately, it comes to me to sign off on it. One of the things we do is we look at the report, and as I said, we have in-car cameras and body-worn camera. So every incident that we typically have is recorded on camera, so we're able to review those pretty extensively. If we were to have an in-custody death or an officer-involved shooting, those type of cases would be investigated or have been investigated by the GBI. So just to give you a little bit of our stats, in 2019 we had 70 uses of force. We made 2,201 arrests that year, and that was, so we used force in about 3% of the incidents. 2018 was 105 use of force incidents. We arrested a little over 2,000 people, and the percentage was a little over 5%. And then 2017, it was 79 uses of force, 2,265 arrests, and about 3.5% of our arrests resulted in a use of force. The most of our use of force is displaying a taser. You'll be surprised if you tell someone to stop or they're going to be tased, a lot of people will stop. And so that has proved to be effective, but we actually record that as a use of force even though they did not deploy the taser. So display of a firearm and display of a taser are the two most prevalent uses of force we have in those stats. Let me move on now to another area where people always have questions, and this is our complaint process. So we accept complaints written by email, anonymously. We have you can text complaints in or submit them on our website. You can call up. However, you can get the complaint to us. We will accept the complaint and review it and process it. For certain levels of complaint, such as the officer was rude to me, that usually the minor complaints will be handled by a shift supervisor. If it's something more serious, we may conduct an internal affairs investigation. In 2017, we had 12 complaints coming from 54,000 calls, which is less than 2% of our calls. 2018 was 11 complaints from roughly the same amount of calls, and then 2019 we had 8 complaints from 67,000 calls, about 1% of our calls. So we do receive complaints from time to time. the majority of which are unfounded, but sometimes they are founded, and we take the appropriate action we deem for that particular incident. Part of our department, and why we spend a lot of time making sure we hire the right officers, is really about our DNA. It's about what we are about, which is community engagement. It's really part of who we are. And I could stand up here and tell you case after case after case where officers have dipped into their own pockets to buy a car seat from someone, or facilitated it, paid for hotel rooms, delivered food to needy people, all kinds of things like that. And they do that not for any recognition, but because they have a compassion to help other people. But we do a lot of things, engage with our community, to be involved, such as our Neighborhood Watch. I'll just list a few of them. Neighborhood Watch program, our Citizen Police Academy, Citizens on Patrol, our volunteer program, our Silent Partners program related to our cameras. We teach CPR, AED classes, active shooter training, mental health first aid, situational awareness training, and a whole list of a lot more. We're involved in a bunch of different charities, such as Christmas for Kids, Special Olympics Georgia. We raise about $15,000 a year for that charity. We participate in the Santa Cop program, Shave Free for Charity, where we make donations to different nonprofits. Right now, we're in the process of doing that as well. We support iCare Atlanta. Our officers run in many of the 5Ks that are in Dunwoody, which are all usually for nonprofit purposes. And we've participated as a department many times in the Convoy for Care that was started for hurricane relief in Louisiana, and we've done that many years, partnering with other agencies and WSB-TV. Because we treat our citizens with the respect and dignity they deserve, and because we are engaged with our citizens outside of the calls for service, we have a great relationship with our community. We do not take this positive relationship lightly, though. I recognize that it could disappear in a moment because of the actions of one officer. That is why we emphasize repeatedly with our staff how important each call for service is to the people of Dunwoody. Every encounter we have is an opportunity to make a positive or a negative impression, and we talk about that at our department constantly. I acknowledge that we are not perfect. Certainly, we do make mistakes. We're human. However, we strive every day to deliver the highest quality service possible to the citizens and learn from any mistakes that we may have made. I want to close with just a couple of snippets of, one's a letter I received, and one was from a email that I received complimenting some of our officers. And these are indicative of the type of compliments that I receive all the time. The first was, I'll just read it to you and tell you a little bit about it, but it says, this is a quote, "I want to say that because of the media and recent press, as a black male, most of our impressions of the police department are not as positive as we would like them to be. However, Officer Jay Leach is an exception to the rule. He treated me with respect, dignity, and compassion." That was sent back in 2017 from a gentleman that we had an encounter with. It was quite a lengthy letter, about 2 pages. I didn't want to stand up here and read the whole thing to you, but that was representative of his comments to us. And then just this week I received this one, and this is a partial quote. "Chief Grogan, in this time when many police establishments are under close scrutiny and judgment, I would like to take this time to commend the Dunwoody Police Department for the extremely fair and oftentimes compassionate actions and behaviors." And this is from a gentleman that we have arrested several times who had a drug problem. And he just wanted to let us know that he appreciated our efforts to help him during this difficult time that he was going through. So in closing, I just want to say that I appreciate the opportunity to stand before all of you today, and you can be confident that you have a well-run police department that are here to serve you to the best of their ability. And with that, I would be happy to open it up for any questions that anyone may have. There's a microphone down here. If you want to come up and ask a question, that would be great. Thank you. And there's Also, if you don't feel comfortable asking a question in front of the group, there are some cards on a table back there. You can go put the question there and somebody will bring it to me and I'll answer the question.
Grogan, first, thank you for being here, and thank you for your service to Dunwoody. We are proud of the police department that we have, and we are always glad to see you all when you're driving around. There has been a lot of concern about changes that ought to be made to address the criminal justice system as far as a history of racial prejudice. And I'm wondering, from your point of view, and for the police department, what kinds of changes do you think need to be made, and larger than the Dunwoody Police Department, but where would you see change most effective to try to address the history of systematic racism that we see, particularly in places like Georgia, but not necessarily places like Dunwoody?
Thank you, Robert. That's a good question, and it's actually that's a hard question to start off with, Robert. That's all right. So I think there's lots of changes that could be made, but one that leapt to my mind, it really is not prevalent here in Dunwoody or in Georgia actually, but it's the idea and the prevalence of police unions. So I know that's been a topic that some of you may have read about in a lot of states, and I'm friends with a lot of chiefs at departments that have unions. And in many cases, it's very difficult to get rid of officers who do really bad things. Not just things like lie or steal, but do really bad things. I know some of the large departments have, hundreds of officers that work at their department that can't police on the road because of their past actions. They've been arrested or they've done things that their credibility as a police officer has been stripped. And so I think that is probably one of the areas that needs some reform on a big scale. And certainly, as I said, it doesn't affect us too much here in Georgia, but a lot of those particular cases go to arbitration, and the people that the police chief fired is able to get their job back. And so that certainly is not helpful when you're trying to get rid of someone who may be inappropriate, and you're trying to get rid of it before it becomes a big deal. The other aspect of that is goes along with the union issue is when we decided to add body-worn cameras. We had discussed that for a period of time, went through a process, council funded it, and we implemented it, and our officers began wearing body cameras. In a lot of places that are unionized, that's not the case. So that's a change in working conditions, and so they have to jump through a lot of hoops, and it's resisted by officers. And so, some technology like body-worn cameras that can help with transparency and help hold officers accountable is not available to those departments because they're not able to implement them. So that's just a couple of things that I would say, Robert, right now. Thank you. Any other questions?
Chief Grogan, always a pleasure. Thank you for your service.
Thank you.
As the leader and example for the Dunwoody Police Department, what steps are you taking personally to learn more about systemic racism so that you can not only teach officers about prejudice and racial sensitivity, but also make Black and brown residents of Dunwoody feel safe?
Thank you, Lydia, for that question. So, obviously, I'm doing what a lot of people are, researching these issues, trying to make sure that I am familiar with all of the issues. We're also doing training. We went through, as I said, some police legitimacy training earlier this year. We're in the process of going through implicit bias training. I will attend that training as well. I've attended implicit bias training before through the IACP, and it's helpful to understand the different perspectives. It's also helpful to understand and be aware that all of us carry prejudices inside of us based on our upbringing, where we were brought up, and things that happened to us over the years. But the important key is, as a police officer, is for us to recognize that, but not let those biases influence our decision making. And so I'm certainly, trying to make sure that not only do I do that, but that all the members of our department do it as well. So thank you.
Hi, Chief.
Hey, Joe.
Former Dunwoody Police Lieutenant Fidel Espinosa.
Can you get a little closer to the mic?
Sure.
Thank you.
Former Dunwoody Police Chief Lieutenant Fidel Espinosa was reportedly removed from the Christmas for Kids program that he created, and there were also known concerns about him with the Scouts Explorer program. So with the obvious apprehensions about Officer Espinosa, why were his actions of sharing and receiving pornographic images via text messages to several officers within the force not known by you? And since, as you mentioned, we don't have a very large police department, why and how could such rampant sexual misconduct go unnoticed by you, our police chief?
Well, Joe, I would love to answer that question, but unfortunately we have pending litigation, so I'm not at liberty to answer that question. But I would have a comment if I could.
I know of no law that prevents you from speaking on it.
I've given you my response.
Okay, well, furthermore, do you find it anything inappropriate about you heading the city's initial investigation into the sexting that occurred when, as you mentioned, you are named as a defendant regarding the matter?
As I said, there's pending litigation. I would be happy to answer that question if I could. Unfortunately, I can't.
One last question then. Do you allow citizens arrested by Dunwoody Police to be in charge of their own investigations? No answer?
No.
All right. Well, I appreciate it. Thank
All right.
you.
Thank you, Joe.
For everyone to know.
Thank you, City of Dunwoody, and go Braves before I start.
You might have to get a little closer.
Go Braves before I start.
Hey.
I'm not going to get as detailed as the previous question, but hearing your values of officer conduct and integrity and courage, what was clear from your investigation is that people were afraid to speak up about what was happening and that it was wrong. So how do you change culture in the department that allows for officers who know what the right thing is to not be afraid to lose their job or have retribution or suffer consequences? It could be about any issue. It doesn't have to be about sexual harassment. It could be just about regular procedures. But I feel there's a loss of confidence that despite all of the training, people were afraid to stop bad behavior that was hurting others.
Well, I would disagree with that characterization, but I can't really comment any further because of the pending litigation. Thank you. Any other questions?
I have one sheet if anybody else has a question.
Okay.
Can you talk a little bit about what de-escalation looks like? I think a lot of people hear the word and they hear the term, but they hear that police should do it, but they don't understand what that means. And I thought it would be enlightening if you could share.
Sure. So de-escalation is really the idea of, in this context, of an officer going into a situation maybe where everyone's agitated. And so the last thing you want to do as a police officer coming on the scene is get people more agitated, cause the situation to get worse. And so officers try to use first, obviously, the words that they say. And that's one of the things that the CIT training helps officers with that. Also, the mental health first aid gives them the verbal skills to be able to talk to someone in a way that's not threatening. So you're trying to do those kinds of things verbally. Also, from a physical standpoint, if a situation is going downhill where force may have to be used, you want to give time and distance. That's what we talk about a lot, so the officer can have more time to make a decision and more distance so the officer's not in danger. And those kind of tactics and things help officers de-escalate situations, maybe to so the person can have time to calm down or not react in a moment of anger and the situation go off the rails. So in a nutshell, that's really what de-escalation is about. A lot of verbal skills, but also even physical, being able to separate ourselves from situations if we can do that safely and without anyone else being put in danger. Any other questions? No? Well, there's a lot of officers over here, and feel free to ask me a question afterwards or ask any of the officers anything that you'd like to ask, and I think maybe the mayor maybe have some closing remarks. Be careful.
I'm telling you. So I want to thank everyone for coming. As Chief said, there'll be an opportunity if you have questions you want to ask individually in person. There'll be an opportunity. I'll be here. Council members can raise your hands again. Raise your hands if you have policy type questions for us. I appreciate Chief taking the time to do this, and we appreciate all your participation, and it's great to see all your faces in person. And with that, I'll wish you a good night and a great weekend. Thank you.